states are not engaging in trying to suppress voters whatsoever. This is clearly an effort by one party to rewrite the rules of our political system.
Wow, that was Minority Leader Mitch McConnell dismissing Democratic legislation that would roll back draconian voter suppression legislation that is sweeping through Republican legislatures across the country. Apparently, the Kentucky senator has spent so much time in his shell that he missed the roughly 250 bills in 43 states that are targeting black, brown, AAPI, and young voters, nearly everywhere that the GQP has legislative control. Mitch's willful ignorance of the fact is a recurring theme for him. Just yesterday, this native of Sheffield, Alabama, born in the 1940s Deep South as Addison Mitchell McConnell Jr., claimed that the filibuster, a Jim Crow relic, has no racial history. McConnell and his Republican cohorts are mounting a frankly hysteria-laced and basically fact-free campaign against a number of popular pieces of legislation, including the For the People Act, which would expand voting rights and roll back the repressive measures that Mitch's fellow Republicans are passing in the states. Today, the Senate held its first hearing to assess the Democrats' preeminent piece of legislation. Former Attorney General Eric Holder, who now leads a Democratic redistricting initiative, appeared before the committee.
It seems to me that this is the right time. This is the right act. Dealing, as I said, with that unholy trinity of voter suppression, dark money, and gerrymandering. These are all things that are handled by this act and will make our electoral system more fair, more responsive, and more available to the American people. And that's why I think this bill should be passed.
Republicans, who are better at cutting taxes for the rich than they are at passing meaningful legislation for the working class, have called this bill a power grab. They're getting backup from West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin, who told reporters that he did not want to pass voting legislation solely along party lines. Despite Manchin's now commonplace obstinance, people close to President Biden are telling Axios that he's feeling bullish on what he can accomplish and that he's fully prepared to support the dashing of the Senate's filibuster rule to allow Democrats to pass voting rights and other trophy legislation for his party. Senator Dick Durbin, the head vote counter for the Democrats, had this warning to all the conservative Democrats, like Manchin, who are skeptical of undoing the old Jim Crow filibuster, which was most prominently used historically to try to stop voting rights for black Americans. And they're trying to convince them to help pass this legislation, said Durbin. Show me that the Senate can operate with a filibuster and still do things that make the U.S. a better nation. Show me. Joining me now is Eric Holder, former U.S. Attorney General and chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Great to see you, General Holder. And let's just start with a few of these myths. Great to see you. Let's start with a few of these myths. Mitch McConnell claims that the filibuster has no racist history. Your thoughts?
Well, the filibuster was used throughout the 20th century to frustrate the passage of civil rights bills. I mean, that first and foremost, you had to get past a just humongous filibuster in 1964 to get the 1964 Civil Rights Bill in place. Same thing again with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But you can go to earlier versions of civil rights bills where Southern senators, Democrats to be fair, were filibustering to try to make sure that civil rights bills did not become the law of the land.
Yeah, Dixiecrats, to be specific. And it is interesting that that sort of faction has moved right on into the party of Lincoln. But what's also interesting is that there are still Southern Democrats and conservative Democrats who are still clinging to the filibuster, a very bad old thing from the old Democratic Party, as you point out. People like Joe Manchin. There was this quote that Joe Biden is feeling sort of the brush of history. He feels like he can pass a lot of really important legislation, including this bill, which is now SR1. It's got a John Lewis Voting Rights Act, et cetera. In your view, you know Joe Biden very well, worked with him. How can he feel that optimistic with people like Joe Manchin still clinging to the filibuster? Well,
I think it's early in the game. And at this point, we're talking about the filibuster in some ways in a vacuum. I think once some of this legislation is actually passed by the Senate, S1, H.R. 4, which is the John Lewis voting advancement bill, perhaps a minimum wage, when it becomes something that is concrete, something that is tangible. And then the question is, are you in favor of the filibuster, or do you want to do that which is morally right and which is also politically popular? That, I think, is when we'll find the true test. And it doesn't mean, that you have to do away with the filibuster. It may be that you carve out parts of the filibuster so that this legislation can, in fact, be passed. So I think, as I said, pressure needs to be placed, but we're not at the near the end of the game at this point.
But we are at the point in the game when Joe Manchin is essentially saying he will not allow anything to pass unless Republicans are on the bill. Do you believe, having dealt with a lot of these same senators, that there are 10 Republicans who would vote for a bill that would make it easier to vote? Because demographically, if more people can vote, more people of color are coming online as voters, and they don't do so well with people of color. There's no political interest for them to let more people vote. Do you believe there are 10 Republicans who would, in any universe that we live in, vote for SR1?
No. And let me be clear, when I say pressure will be brought to bear, I mean on Democrats, not on Republicans. They've made the determination that they can't win elections where more people vote. And so they've made a determination that what they're going to do is to try to change the rules. They are happy being a minority party that exercises majority power, and they are okay with that. And so, no, I don't expect any pressure can be brought on Republicans sufficient to get 10 Republicans to vote for any of this vote reform legislation.
Yeah, let me let you listen to one of those Republicans. Here's Ted Cruz making his argument against the law, against the For the People Act.
This bill is the single most dangerous bill this committee has ever considered. This bill is designed to corrupt the election process permanently, and it is a brazen and shameless power grab by Democrats. They do this by instituting a bill that will promote widespread fraud and illegal voting. Apparently, the Democrats have determined that if millions of illegal aliens get to vote, if millions of criminals get to vote, that will benefit Democrats because they understand that criminals and illegal aliens are much, much more likely to vote for Democrats.
Given the fact that Ted Cruz is a man of color, this is probably the most ironic pro-white supremacist argument I've ever heard about voting. But what do you make of the fact that someone like Ted Cruz, whose own family includes, people of color from a Latino country, would just boldly make the argument that the people of color who might be allowed to vote are basically just a bunch of criminals, and that the only reason Democrats want people to vote is that they think that they're going to hand out voting cards to the undocumented, who, by the way, if they become citizens, they should be able to vote if they're citizens, right?
Joy, this is all about power. It's all about power, the maintenance, the retention of power. The Republicans understand that demographics are changing, that the ideology of the nation is changing, and it's moving away from them. And they're not going to change their programs. They're not going to change their policy perspectives. And so the only way in which they can stay competitive in the game is to somehow frustrate the desires of people to vote, people of color. Primarily. And so that's what he is talking about. And they'll try to say it's all about voter fraud. They've been saying, this stuff about voter fraud for decades now without any proof that there is any widespread voter fraud. Study after study has shown that to be a false claim. Nevertheless, it is the foundation for all that they try to do. They say that, but the reality is they're just going to try to hold on to power.
Yeah, I mean, I won't even play it, but Cindy Hyde-Smith of Mississippi, who once said she'd be front row at a hanging, a.k.a. a lynching, she tried to argue that Sunday voting is wrong because Sunday is the Sabbath. Forgetting, Saturday is also the Sabbath for Jewish folks, that she didn't have to say that shouldn't. The arguments are so absurd at this point. Have you had a conversation yourself with Joe Manchin or with some of these other conservative Democrats who are literally clinging to the filibuster? Seemingly, they care more about the filibuster and maintaining it, this old Jim Crow thing, than they do about democracy or voting or anything else.
You see, that's exactly the question that will have to be posed, I think, just at a later time and not too far from now. Do you care more about the filibuster, or do you care more about democracy protection? That really is the question. And my hope will be, and I think the pressure will be brought to bear on those who say that they don't want to do something with the filibuster, that there will be both a price to pay, and that is just not something that I think Democratic senators ultimately will follow. That's at least my hope. But as I said, the pressure is intensifying, but the pressure will be at its maximum after the bill has passed.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.